"You didn't say you were built like a mule," he spat, then walked away, leaving her alone on the snowy platform, humiliated and trembling. The flowers slipped from her hands. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The letter arrived on a gray Tuesday, folded once and written in a hand both square and gentle. The ink had bled slightly along the lines of the paper, as if even the words had been softened by time. Margaret had read it aloud at first, once, then again, as though speaking it might make it more real. The writer, a man named Walter Clegg, had described a life that was not grand, but steady. He wrote of coffee brewed before dawn, of a porch that faced the woods, of evenings lit by oil lamp and quiet talk. There was no flourish in his language, only the kind of plain sincerity that felt, to Margaret, more romantic than all the florid poems she'd secretly kept since girlhood. He had asked for someone who could bake, tend to a household, and speak kindly when there was nothing left to say. He had signed it simply, "I don't need perfection, just peace." It was that last line that broke her. At 38, Margaret had come to expect very little. Townsfolk in Mill River had stopped looking her in the eye long ago. Their comments weren't cruel, not exactly, just clipped, clinical, like she were a matter of measurement. Too thick at the waist. Not ladylike. A good worker, but rough. That last part had always stayed with her. Rough. As though her skin were bark and not something that had once known touch. She told no one she was leaving. She sold her mother's cedar chest and the last of her quilting fabrics to buy a train ticket west. She packed her things with the precision of someone who had learned to survive on almost nothing. The shawl her aunt had stitched the winter of her father's death, a photograph of her parents standing proud in front of a clapboard house, and a rye loaf, warm from the oven, still smelling of molasses and smoke. When the train pulled into Gray Ridge 3 days later, the sky was a soft wash of snow. She stepped off with her spine straight, her heart galloping beneath a woolen coat. Her hands trembled, but not from cold. From that fragile, flickering thing she hadn't dared to feed in years, the belief that someone, somewhere, might choose her. At the edge of the platform, she stood with her one trunk and a bundle of asters gathered from a fence post near the last station. She smoothed her hair with gloved fingers. She smiled when she saw him approach. She did not yet know that this moment, this single breath of belief, would be the last time she let herself feel like a bride. The door to the inn had been shut without apology. No room, they said. No space for a woman like her, though rooms had been offered to strangers with less than she carried. But Margaret didn't argue. She simply stepped back into the snow, the hem of her skirt already rimmed in frost. By nightfall, the whispers had taken root. They began as sideways glances in the general store, a raised brow, a muttered comment over sacks of flour. But Gray Ridge was small, and in small towns, stories traveled faster than horses. Before the moon had cleared the trees, Margaret had been turned into something simpler than a woman, a punchline, the mule bride, the desperate one, the one who tricked a man into writing her a letter. They said she'd hidden her figure in the photograph. They said no decent woman would travel alone. One man claimed she'd brought a curse, that ever since she stepped off the train, the cold had settled in deeper than before. No one asked her name. She spent that first night on a bench beside the old water tower, her back pressed to the stone, the cold needling its way through the seams of her coat. Her rye loaf had frozen solid in her bag. She held it anyway, like something sacred, because it was the last thing she'd made in a place where she'd still been somebody. She didn't sleep, only sat there, watching as windows flickered out one by one, the warmth inside them sealed tight against the likes of her. By morning, her hands were stiff and raw, her cheeks mottled with red. She might have collapsed had it not been for a quiet voice behind her. Mrs. Healy, wrapped in a worn plaid shawl, boots unlaced. "I've a cot upstairs," the woman said. "Not much, but I know the sound of doors closing behind you." Margaret followed without a word, not from pride, but from the knowledge that if she spoke, her voice might splinter. She worked without being asked, mending hems, sweeping floors, bringing in firewood. She made pies no one bought and stitched sachets that sat unsold by the register. Still, she kept at it. A rhythm of purpose, if not belonging. But something shifted inside her. She stopped pinning her hair, stopped pausing near the station, where she'd once stood with flowers and hope in her hands. The letter, now creased and faded, remained tucked beneath her pillow, unopened. Not from bitterness, but because rereading it felt like trespassing into a life she'd never get to live. What truly broke her wasn't Walter's words. She had heard worse. It was the laughter, the careless ease with which people discarded her, as if her worth had been measured and found not just lacking, but laughable. And so, Margaret learned the most brutal lesson of all. It is not the cruelty that wounds deepest, but the silence that follows. Silas Boone was a man of trees and silence. He spoke to birch and pine more often than he did to people. In the forest, his hands had purpose, and his mind stayed still. The world out there, in town, was too loud, too eager to define a man before he opened his mouth. So Silas stopped trying. Years ago, he built a cabin beyond the bend of Wolf Creek, where the only visitors were wind and memory. He kept a photograph of his brother in his Bible and his mother's quilt folded over the rocker by the hearth. He did not expect company. He did not expect anything. Until he saw Margaret. He noticed her first not by sight, but by stillness, a kind of quiet resistance she carried with her like a shawl. Where others ducked their heads or bit back at whispers, she did neither. She met every sideways glance with eyes calm and clear, as if to say, "You cannot make me disappear by refusing to see me." It unsettled some, that strength. Silas understood that too well. He never meant to linger. But he found himself pausing at the edge of the tree line when he came down to trade. Watching her through the windows of the apothecary as she kneaded dough, stitched loose buttons, arranged herbs on the sill like they were poems in green and lavender. She never smiled easily, but when she did, usually at Mrs. Healy's stories about her late husband's snoring, it was something that stayed with him all the way back to the cabin. He left the bundle of kindling on a day when the wind snapped harsh against the shutters, not out of charity. He'd seen how fiercely she guarded her usefulness. It was simply a gesture, a language he understood better than speech. Next came the pears, sealed in syrup, from the trees his mother once tended. After that, the book, Wuthering Heights. She looked like someone who read in the quiet hours before dawn, someone who needed words not for escape, but for recognition. He slipped a note inside the front cover. "You read between the lines. So will I." Days passed before she answered. No words, just a warm loaf of sourdough left on the porch bench outside the general store. A crust so perfectly browned it looked kissed by fire, not baked. From then on, they exchanged only nods, subtle, deliberate. There were no declarations, no borrowed phrases, only gestures. And in those small exchanges, the passing of a basket handle, the slow turning of a head to meet the other's gaze, something began to unfurl. Not love, not yet, but something tender and watchful, something that had the patience to grow, like roots spreading quiet beneath snow. Silas did not need to be told her story. He could read the way she moved, cautious, composed, like someone who'd once been shattered but learned how to carry every piece. He didn't pity her, he recognized her. And recognition, sometimes, is the rarest kind of love's beginning. The path to Silas's cabin wound upward through moss-laced trees, the air soft with the scent of pine resin and warming earth. Margaret carried a basket close to her chest. Inside, 2 jars of strawberry jam, a half-dozen buttered rolls still warm from Mrs. Healy's oven, and a square of cloth she had embroidered herself, not with flowers or initials, but a line of stitched pine trees, tall and unyielding. She didn't rush. The forest never asked for hurry, and neither did the man waiting at its center. When she found him, he was bent over a fence rail, sleeves rolled to the elbow, forearms nicked with bark and work. His skin was browned by sun, dusted with sawdust. The hammer paused in his hand when he saw her, but he didn't speak. Neither did she. The hush between them had ceased to be awkward long ago. It had become a kind of language, a place where nothing needed translation. They stood like that for a long moment, the woods alive with birdsong and breeze, until Silas leaned back against the post and said quietly, "They don't know what they missed, do they?" Margaret's smile came slow, edged in sorrow but also peace. "They didn't even try to look." He stepped forward then, not in haste, but with the steadiness of someone approaching something sacred. From his pocket, he drew a small velvet pouch. Inside, nestled like a secret, was a ring, carved from pine wood, smoothed by hand, a thin braid etched along its edge. "It's not gold," he said, voice low, "but it's strong." He took her hand and slipped it on her finger, roughened by years of labor and winter wind. "Like you." Her breath caught, not from surprise, but from the flood of something too long withheld, being seen. Not past the curves or the calluses, not despite them, but through them, all the way to the center. The wedding took place beneath a canopy of tall pines, the air golden with late spring light. There were no ribbons, no fanfare, just Silas, Margaret, Mrs. Healy with tears in her eyes, and a scattering of townsfolk who came with lowered heads and quiet guilt stitched into their collars. Walter Clegg had long since vanished, forgotten before the ink on his name had faded. No one mentioned him. When Silas whispered his vow, "You were never too much, they were just too small." The wind stirred the needles overhead like an amen. They walked back to the cabin as man and wife, their hands clasped, their steps slow. Pine needles crackled underfoot like the world making space for something new. And Margaret, once silenced, once scorned, no longer needed to wonder if she was worthy. She had not been rejected. She had simply been waiting for someone who could see.